Good to see you again. This is ARIRANG News, live from our studio in Seoul. I'm Laah Hyun-kyung. We begin this afternoon with Korea's military court sentencing a soldier to death. A 23-year-old surgeon surnamed Im was given the death penalty on Tuesday for killing 5 and wounding 7 soldiers in a shooting rampage last June. The military court says just because he suffered bullying in school and the army doesn't mean he can get a pardon for killing people, adding that Im didn't show any remorse leading up to the ruling, leaving the court no choice but to isolate him from society for good. Im's lawyer says they will appeal the court's decision. The case will now go to the High Military Court. Moving on to the nut rage incident, 3 years is how much time the prosecution thinks Cho Hyun-ah should spend in jail. At a final hearing on Monday, Cho, the former VP of Korean Air, said she didn't know that ordering the chief steward off the plane was violating the law. For this story, here's Connie Kim.
Prosecutors are calling for a 3-year jail term for the former vice president of Korean Air for her actions in the so-called nut rage incident. Cho Hyun-ah is charged with violating aviation safety regulations, coercion, and interference in the execution of duty after she ordered a senior crew member off a Seoul-bound flight in New York because her nuts were served in a bag and not on a plate. She had also ordered the plane to return to the gate. Cho said she is sorry for her hasty behavior, but defended her actions by saying the case happened because of her devotion to her work. She said she did not know the purser Park Chang-jin has law enforcement authority during flight and that ordering him off the plane was a safety risk. The purser, who testified Monday, rebutted Cho's claims, saying she treated him and the other flight attendants as feudal slaves and said Cho used violence against him. Cho did admit to using violence against one crew member, but flatly rejected claims that she had hit Park. Explaining its decision, prosecutors said Cho had partially admitted to some of her wrongdoing, but was still putting the blame on Park and the captain. They added Cho had showed no remorse for her actions. The verdict is expected later this month. The so-called nut rage incident has infuriated the public as families at founded conglomerates dominating the economy are often seen acting with a disregard for the law. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
In domestic politics, the newly elected floor leader of the ruling Saenuri Party is widely seen as a leading critic of the president's policies. While stressing unity, he's calling for changes to regain the public's trust, saying that both the president and the ruling party are facing a crisis. For more, here's our Lee Ji-yoon.
For the ruling party's new floor leader, Yoo Seung-min, his win wasn't about an anti-President Park Geun-hye camp defeating a pro-Bak faction. For him, it signaled a chance for the ruling camp to reform and rebound ahead of next year's general elections. With President Park's approval ratings at their lowest level since she took office, Yoo is calling for policy changes to win back the hearts of a disappointed public. Pointing to criticism of the president's personnel picks, Yoo told reporters that President Park must carry out a drastic shakeup of her people. As for policymaking, he believes the party should take a stance vis-a-vis the presidential office. To do that, he says the party should no longer just support whatever the presidential office lays out in front of them. Instead, the party should play a leading role in setting the agenda for the nation. Yoo, however, did promise to improve communications and cooperation with the government to iron out differences before putting major policies into motion. In response to the government's push to increase taxes to cover welfare benefits, he said it's either higher taxes with more benefits or lower taxes with less welfare, not more welfare without a tax hike. Political analysts say the new floor leader's eagerness for change could turn the page for the ruling camp. But it remains to be seen whether the presidential office will lend an ear to his criticisms and demands. Lee Ji-yoon, ARIRANG News.
Reports are coming out that the U.S. and North Korea have been talking about meeting behind closed doors. This comes as the two sides on the surface have been blaming each other for the current deadlock in dialogue. For this next report, here's our Hwang Sung-hee.
Washington began the new year imposing more sanctions on North Korea, But behind the scenes, the two longtime foes have reportedly been discussing the prospects of restarting dialogue. Citing multiple sources, The Washington Post reported Monday that U.S. Special Envoy for North Korea Policy Sung Kim proposed to meet with North Korean officials in Beijing. This ahead of his trip to Tokyo last week for a trilateral meeting with his South Korean and Japanese counterparts. The report says the North offered to send Lee Young-ho to Beijing or suggested the U.S. diplomat visit Pyongyang for a meeting with Kim Kye-kwan and Kang Seok-ju, who are both more senior in the foreign ministry than Lee. On a similar note, Seoul-based Yonhap News Agency reported Tuesday that Sung Kim's offer didn't materialize because the North insisted on holding the talks in Pyongyang. This comes as the two sides blame each other for the deadlock in dialogue. Following the trilateral meeting in Tokyo, the U.S. diplomat reiterated the conditions for talks.
North Koreans will need to demonstrate its commitment to denuclearization in a concrete manner before we can resume any serious negotiations.
North Korea lashed out over the weekend, saying Washington rejected its invitation. But the regime seems far from committed to giving up its nuclear ambitions. Recent satellite imagery shows fresh activity at North Korea's main nuclear plant, a possible indication a reactor there was being restarted. Hwang Sung-hee, ARIRANG News.
Meanwhile, a study by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization shows that an average North Korean consumed roughly 2,100 calories a day in 2011. That's only about 200 calories more than 50 years ago. The UN recommends a daily calorie intake of 2,500 calories for adults, and the global average stands at nearly 2,900. North Koreans are also not eating balanced meals, as 2/3 of their calories come from grains, while their meat consumption has been cut in half since the Great Famine of the mid to late 1990s. Now, to give you some context, an average South Korean consumes more than 3,300 calories a day. Chinese Defense Minister Chang Wan-chun is in Seoul for a 3-day visit starting this Tuesday, and he is scheduled to hold talks with his South Korean counterpart Han Min-gu on Wednesday. Topping the agenda of the meeting will be military and nuclear threats from Pyongyang and the current security situation on the peninsula. They will also discuss ways to further boost bilateral cooperation, including the establishment of a direct military hotline between the two countries. Chang is the third Chinese defense minister to visit South Korea, and his visit follows a trip to Beijing by Seoul's former defense chief Kim Kwan-jin in 2011. The last time a Chinese defense minister visited Seoul was in 2006. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has raised the possibility of Japan's military playing a more active role in rescuing its citizens abroad in the wake of the killing of 2 Japanese hostages by Islamic State militants. At a parliamentary committee on Monday, Abe said ensuring the safety of Japanese citizens is the responsibility of the government and that he is the person who holds the most responsibility. Abe once again condemned the militants and emphasized that Tokyo needed to be able to protect its citizens, but some critics say he is using this as an opportunity to push ahead with his agenda to have the right to collective self-defense. In other words, allow Japan's military to fight overseas to help allies under attack. And now we go to eastern Ukraine. The situation there isn't improving much. Officials in Washington are reportedly mulling over sending weapons to support the rebels fighting Russia-backed separatists. And the rebels are planning on raising their troop numbers. Connie Lee reports.
The U.S. could be sending lethal aid to Ukraine to help its government fight off attacks by pro-Russian rebels.
We haven't taken options on or off the table. It's an ongoing discussion. Obviously, we take into account events on the ground, but I don't have anything to lay out for you in terms of internal deliberations.
The aid in the form of defensive weapons could include anti-tank, anti-air, and anti-mortar systems.
Washington already provides non-lethal military equipment to Ukraine, but U.S. officials say the consideration to send lethal weapons shows Washington's growing frustration with Russia's continued support for rebels and the failed peace talks over the weekend. In a news conference Monday, the rebels blamed Kiev for the collapse of peace talks and said Russia was their true friend.
The hand stretched to us by Russia, by brotherly nation, is turning into a road of life. And today we can clearly see who are our friends and who are not.
The rebels have vowed to increase forces to up to 100,000 for their latest offensive strategy in East Ukraine. With this call, the pro-Russian separatists seek to intensify the 9-month-long conflict and push the government forces out of the east of the country. Violence has escalated in recent weeks, with both sides mobilizing more forces and more civilians losing their lives. According to the UN, more than 5,000 people have been killed in the conflict. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News.
U.S. President Barack Obama has submitted a new spending plan for the next fiscal year. It's a near $4 trillion proposal taxing the rich to revive the middle class. But a lot of pundits are already saying it's a plan the Republican-controlled Congress is unlikely to pass. ARIRANG News' Song Ji-sun breaks down the numbers for us.
Practical, not partisan. That's how U.S. President Barack Obama described his budget proposal of nearly $4 trillion for the fiscal year 2016, which starts in October this year. As earlier outlined in State of the Union speech last month, Obama's plan is aimed at taxing the wealthy to support the middle class. It calls for a one-time 14% tax on an estimated $2.1 trillion US of untaxed overseas income, while imposing a 19% tax on U.S. companies' future foreign earnings. Obama is also looking to close tax loopholes, such as one on carried interest, to help fund investments in infrastructure and education.
It gives Americans of every age the chance to upgrade their skills so they can earn higher wages. And it includes my plan to make 2 years of community college free for responsible students.
The budget calls for $612 billion in overall military spending, which includes funding to defeat Islamic State militants and support NATO and European allies against Russian aggression. The budget foresees a $474 billion deficit at 2.5% of the U.S. GDP, which is the lowest level since 2008. It's projected to stabilize at that level, reducing the deficit by $1.8 trillion over the next decade. The proposal requires approval from the Congress but faces a rocky road ahead, with House Speaker John Boehner rating Obama's plan as unbalanced, with more spending, more taxes, and more debt. Song Ji-sun, ARIRANG News.
Korea's aging society is causing some major changes in the country's workforce. A recent report predicts that the number of working elderly will increase in 35 years' time, but the quality of their jobs cannot be guaranteed. So those of you in their 20s and 30s might want to rethink your retirement plans ahead of time. Hwang Ji-hye has more.
A new report by the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs predicts the employment rate for the country's elderly will stand at over 40% in the year 2050. That's up almost 10 percentage points from 2010. The report also says the number of Koreans aged 65 or older that are participating in economic activities will reach over 7.3 million in 2050. The report says a rising life expectancy, which has forced more and more older people into poverty after retirement, is keeping the elderly in the job market. Statistics Korea says the country's life expectancy will reach 82 in 2020, whereas the age stood at 77 in 2002. Considering that the official retirement age is now 60, the elderly will have to spend around 20 more years without any additional income. Korea has, in fact, one of the most rapidly aging populations among advanced economies as the country's birth rate remains low. And Korea's statistics agency says the trend will accelerate with the number of marriages expected to dip to its lowest point last year since 2003. The agency says that the number of marriages will have a direct impact on the country's birth rates in the near future. 황지혜, 아리랑 뉴스.
Korea's consumer prices grew at a rate below 1% for the second straight month in January. Statistics Korea says the index rose just 0.8% last month from a year earlier. This is raising concerns about deflation, but the Finance Ministry ruled out such a possibility, attributing the slow price growth to falling global oil prices. They explain the over 20% drop in oil prices in January from a year ago was steep enough to offset a cigarette price hike last month. Core inflation, which excludes volatile oil and food prices, rose 2.4% last month from a year earlier. Korean products are gaining a stronger foothold in China. Locally made goods accounted for nearly 10% of China's total imports last year, or about $190 billion. That's up from 9.2% in 2013 and puts Korea in first place in terms of market share for the second straight year. Japan came in second, followed by the U.S. and Taiwan. The Korea International Trade Association attributes the strong presence of Korean products to an increase in demand for semiconductors and auto parts. China imported over $50 billion worth of semiconductors from Korea and nearly $4 billion worth of Korean auto parts last year. Korea is well known around the world for its enthusiasm about education. The average Korean family spends nearly 7% of its income on learning, but the current economic conditions may have prompted households to redistribute their spending. Kim Ji-yeon has this story.
There are chimes at midnight, but high school students in Korea are often still packed with students studying their textbooks. Some shell out big money to follow a separate curriculum offered by private academies in addition to their class materials. It shows just how much Koreans prioritize education, as attending a good university has a tremendous impact on a person's career. However, in recent months, the bad economy has started to have an effect on how much Koreans spend on education. In fact, the Bank of Korea and the Education Ministry say private academy expenses tumbled to a 3-year low last year. During the January to November period, money spent on private education academies dropped 0.8% from the same period last year to $7.3 billion. The number of students studying overseas also dropped from 262,000 in 2011 to less than 220,000 last year. Overseas education spending plunged 14% last year compared to the previous year, amounting to $372 million, a 9-year low. An official from the Education Ministry says students are heading to English-speaking countries with lower living expenses. The number of Korean students studying in Western countries has waned. In particular, those in Britain have dropped by nearly 60%. In stark contrast, Korean students studying in the Philippines jumped 52% to more than 7,000 last year. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
Bringing you the fresh updates from stories breaking in Korea and abroad. We give you a bigger and better picture of the world. Join Laah Hyun-kyung live from Seoul. Every weekday, only on ARIRANG.
Creating something new usually requires teamwork, well-organized engineering and developmental support, but for one local inventor, determination and thinking outside the box is all it took. He has nearly 100 inventions under his belt, and our Kim Min-ji had a chance to talk to him. Take a look.
It looks like a scene from Spider-Man. The device, made with parts of several vacuum cleaners, enables a full-grown man to climb a wall. You might think creating something like this will require many hands with an understanding of scientific theory and technical skills, but it was made by one person on the ground floor of this very average-looking building. The space is a lab of researcher Oh Jang-gun, who has spent nearly 3 decades of his life here, working on objects ranging from the functional to the bizarre.
If I come across a new technology while reading or surfing the net, I map it out. Then I think about what it could be used for and what types of people would need it.
Oh is responsible for nearly 100 inventions that include sophisticated vehicles like hovercrafts and human-part aircrafts, and the unusual, such as this fighter robot. A person can ride it and control the arms, and anything can be fired from the pistols. Oh may be a bit eccentric, but he does have a humane side, and he is mostly concerned about people in need.
I've made customized wheelchairs for the disabled. Everyone has a different disability, so the one I made was to suit the individual.
What's more is that Oh isn't interested in commercializing his creations or making a fortune with them, and this is just something he does because he enjoys it. His latest project is a walking robot, which he says is the first step to making a wearable robot.
사람이 걸어갈 때 무릎 굽혀지는 거, 발목 굽혀지는 거.
Oh hopes that someday the smart gadget will boost the strength of those who find it hard to stand, walk, or use their legs. Kim Min-ji, ARIRANG News.
Well, many Korean classical musicians go abroad at a very young age to study music and often make their mark on the international music scene. But today, our Im Yoon-hee introduces us to 2 such musicians who are also making waves right here in Korea.
The sweet, sorrowful sounds of the violin, blended with the percussive accents of the classical guitar. The reputable guitar duo Lee Sung-woo and Oliver Fartash-Naini have joined forces with one of Korea's leading young violinists, Shin Ji-ah. They've collaborated on the recently released album Canto Antigo, a collection of 16 Latin American folk pieces.
It's a chance for me to reflect through a variety of pieces. In particular, with this project, I heard echoes of the Korean cultural piece ARIRANG, and I grew fond of it.
The trio is set to play in Seoul this Valentine's Day. Another young classical musician taking the spotlight is pianist Im Hyun-kyung. In 2011, she was the youngest pianist to undertake the complete cycle of Beethoven's piano sonatas, an accomplishment that put her front and center on the global classical music stage. The one-night-only performance includes works by Beethoven, Bach, and Rachmaninoff. Im Yoon-hee, ARIRANG News.
Welcome back. I'm Michelle Park here with the latest weather forecast. It's the first week of February and the weather feels like a mild spring here in the capital. And according to Korea Meteorological Administration, we are expecting temperatures above seasonal average this month. The nation started the day 2 to 3 degrees higher compared to yesterday, and we are looking at milder temperatures all day, but always keep in mind of the temperature gaps between the daytime and nighttime, so make sure to dress accordingly. Now up in the sky above us, we can expect continuous clouds drifting by here in the central region and in Chungcheong provinces. Now meanwhile, there's still a high levels of fine dust in Gangwon province and a dry weather nationwide. Now let's take a look at the readings for today. Seoul will be lingering around 6 degrees this afternoon, while the southern cities such as Gwangju and Busan will reach up to 8 and 11 degrees. And to other regions, Jeju-Wallen peaks up higher at 10, Dokdo hits 4, while Gangnam drops low to -4 degrees. Well, that's all for now, Michelle Park, and here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's ARIRANG News for now. I'm Laah Hyun-kyung. Thanks for staying with us. More news coming up at 6 p.m. Korea time.